Thanks, John. Good morning and welcome to you all. It's my pleasure to host a special webinar for members on butterflies and butterfly counts in Ontario. I hope you're managing during the current heat wave. It's pretty hot, but hopefully you're finding some cooler places outdoors to enjoy nature. Now is the peak time for butterfly enthusiasts. There are butterfly counts taking place around the province this month, so it's the perfect time for this webinar to whet your appetite for learning about these spectacular insects. We're really delighted to have butterfly enthusiast and expert James Kamstra lead this webinar for us. James is a well-known and highly experienced field ecologist with a broad interest in natural history, particularly in the fields of botany, birds, reptiles, and insects. And I don't think there's much about natural history that James is not an expert on. He has made many presentations on natural history topics and has led many outings for Ontario Nature and for other organizations. He's also led eco-tour groups outside of the country to places like Belize, Brazil, Costa Rica, Cuba, the Galapagos, Guyana, and Peru. James is a senior ecologist with a consulting firm and conducts environmental impact studies, biophysical investigations, wetland evaluations, and ecological restoration projects. And I should highlight that James is a longtime member of Ontario Nature. In fact, he just told me he's been a member since 1971, so I'd be curious to know if any of you can beat that. And also, we're very fortunate to have James currently serving as a director on Ontario Nature's board. James has been interested in butterflies and other insects since he was 11, and he now coordinates 2 annual butterfly counts and is currently the Ontario Regional Editor for the North American Butterfly Association. So he compiles results from all of the provincial butterfly counts. So with that, I would like to welcome James as our special webinar speaker. Thank you, James.
Thank you for that introduction, Caroline. My pleasure to be here, and I'm going to share with you something that has been a passion of mine for many years, 50 years in fact. I've been looking at butterflies. Now, I started collecting, and back in those days, pretty much anyone into butterflies and insects was a collector. So now we are in a different time. We have so many good resources available to us. And so generally most butterfly enthusiasts no longer collect, but they do collect with their camera. So one of the things back in 1992, I was invited to participate in a butterfly count. Now, I had never heard of them before, but a friend of mine who lived down near Long Point, he said, we have this butterfly count and why don't you come out with us? So I went out and joined a group. We were out all day hunting butterflies. It was just great fun. We had a tally at the end and a barbecue. And I thought, this is something that we could do in our own area. So the next year, 1993, I started the first butterfly count, which was called Oshawa. It was really situated from the north end of Oshawa to the south end of Lake Scugog, highlighting the Oak Ridges Moraine, running through the middle because there is a lot of good habitat through that area. And so the whole circle is 24 kilometers in diameter, so a pretty big area. And I notified people I knew that were interested in butterflies. I was a member of the Toronto Entomological Association and our Naturalist Club and had quite a good turnout. This picture here is actually from the second count. I used to have a tally and a barbecue at my house at the end where you tally the results. Then I found another area in the north part of Durham, which was even better for butterflies. There was a rail trail near Blackwater, and this interesting, beautiful butterfly called a Baltimore turned up. I checked it out, and they were quite common in the area. So I thought this would be a really good spot, even a better spot to have a count. So I established the second count in the north part of Durham, which is called the Sunderland count. The rail trail extends along the eastern part, so I tried to maximize the amount of rail trail, and that was really the start of that count. And so both of those counts have been going on for about 25 years. Now the whole approach to butterfly counts was started by the Xerces Society, which is a insect conservation group based in the US, and they started back in 1975. Now they borrowed very heavily from the approach taken by the Christmas bird counts, which I'm sure many of you have been on. It's the same size circle, 24 kilometers or 15-mile diameter, and it takes the same approach. Basically go out all day, count everything you see, and bring the results, compile them all at the end. Now the butterfly counts are no longer being coordinated by the Xerces Society. It's through the North American Butterfly Association. They put out an annual report which has all of the counts in it. There's about 400 counts done, mostly in the US, but some in Canada and some even in Mexico. In Ontario, we had last year, we had 33 counts across the province. Now, most of them are in Southern Ontario. We can see here where all of the counts were located. Most of them probably will be done this year, but I know a few have been canceled because of the COVID thing. But you can see we've got good representation in Central Ontario, South Central Ontario. We've got good representation in the Carolinian area over here. They go as far north as Sudbury. But you can see there's some big gaps, and we've lost a few over the year. We did have a couple in the Bruce, and so not all of them have been continued on, but we've got pretty good representation. There's also a couple up in northwestern Ontario, one near Lake of the Woods and another at Atikokan. Good representation for the south. Of course, there's this huge area of northern Ontario which has many different species of butterflies that we don't get in the south, so we generally don't pick up too many of those every year. But nonetheless, we've got a good range of counts. Here you can just see a summary of the counts. You can see the number of species, the number of individuals. Notice Haliburton Highlands, way more butterflies than any other count. I'll tell you why later. As you can see, the number of participants range from anywhere from 1 to 36. The number of hours range anywhere from 5 to 90 hours. Here you can see the districts, so a pretty good range of counts in Ontario. Basically how the counts are done, we break up that circle into smaller units that groups will go out for the day, try to cover the area as best as they can. A 24-kilometer diameter circle is really insane for butterflies. If you do bird counts, you'll know how hard it is to count the birds in an area that big, so just imagine butterflies. But you do the best we can, keep track of our hours. There's always lots of habitat that is really inhospitable, large agricultural areas. So really the groups go out and search for certain places where they know the butterflies are likely to be. Weather is hugely critical for the butterfly counts. If it's a cold, rainy, heavily cloudy day, you might as well forget it, just cancel the count, the results won't mean anything. Butterflies are sun-loving organisms, and a warm sunny day like we've been having lately is really good for counting butterflies. So often they have a rain date and they will be postponed if the conditions are not suitable. But we get out there, try to count all the species, all the individuals that we can. Now the timing of the butterfly counts is fairly critical because although we think of all of summer as being butterfly season, really, most of our species are single brooded, and they might only be on the wing for 3 or 4 weeks of the year. And so how do we capture all of those species? We get early species like the Arctic skipper, which are in generally the early part of June, and then you get the later species that come out in midsummer, like the hairstreaks. So how do we find a date that captures all of those species? Some of our species are really early, like the elfins, that generally we don't get on the counts at all, or the Leonard skipper, which is kind of the exception to most of it. It comes out in August. So those two species are generally not picked up on the counts. But we figure out a date that captures the maximum number of species, and that's generally late June to late July. So yes, small, and the peaks of these species might be very short. We might have 1 week when a certain species is at its peak. We don't catch it all, but we do the best we can. The way the weather is can affect the butterfly emergence. If we think of spring, like this year we had quite a late spring. Some years we have an early spring, and that will transpose into butterfly season. I use the red-winged blackbird here, which to me is the harbinger of spring. But all these butterflies, they are dependent on how quickly the plants emerge and how warm the temperatures get. I'll use an example, the Baltimore butterfly. You can see the caterpillar and the pupa here. It overwinters, it hatches in midsummer, and then it gets about half size, hibernates as a caterpillar, comes up in the spring, and then will feed again for a month or so, and then will pupate. And so it kind of, if the spring is early, the plants leaf out, the caterpillars emerge early, and they will fly earlier. Other species like the hairstreaks, coral hairstreak, for example, the larva feeds on cherry, a tree that has really tough leaves. So it lays its eggs in the midsummer, but those eggs don't hatch until the following spring. Coincides with when the tree leaves out, because those caterpillars will eat that tender foliage when it's not too tough. And so that's why they emerge later in the summer than the early species. Many of our butterflies overwinter as a pupa, such as the tiger swallowtail, which we see here. And whenever the conditions warm up sufficiently, they will come out. But every species is a little bit different in when it comes out. Maintaining a good butterfly count, we need participants. So the more people I can get on the count, the better it is. And the more coverage we get and the more individuals that we can count. We really need, with every group, you need to have one expert, but other than that, we get lots of newcomers that come out, and after they've been on the count a few years, it's amazing how quickly they pick up the species. Often I've had people that come out, didn't know much about butterflies, they get out the first time and it turns them on. Just seeing those beautiful little insects flying around really is a delight. Of course, many of our butterflies are challenging to identify. We have the skippers, which are small, fast-flying individuals. They make up about 1/3 of all the species, so you can't ignore the skippers. And so there's a challenge here. We see 2 of our species. They look quite similar, but once you get to learn them, or you get out with the experts, and they can tell which species they are. Even the experts sometimes have problems. You get some individuals which are a little bit different looking, a little bit aberrant. And then there's estimating or counting the number of individuals, which can be a real challenge. This picture here was taken last year on the Halliburton count. And all those little orange flecks that you see are European skippers. There were thousands of European skippers. Just trying to count them, you estimate 10, 20, 30, or 100, 200, 300. Do the best you can. It's not going to be 100% accurate, but keep track of the hours and do the best we can. Take some practice. Doing a successful butterfly count really entails visiting a variety of habitats. Some butterflies like wet conditions, some like dry conditions, some like mesic, some like semi-shade. So the bigger the range of habitats that we visit, the better we're able to reflect the true butterfly fauna that's out there. And then it's always a challenge from one year to another, just see how many species we get. There's always a little bit of friendly competition between the groups, see who can find the most number of species or the rarest number of species. It just adds to the fun at the end of the day when we have our tally. Now the Sunderland count, which is the one in North Durham, has one of the highest numbers of species of any of our Ontario counts. Sometimes we've had over 60 species, which is pretty amazing for any of the counts. Not even very few of the US counts ever get over 60 species. And so even 50 is a pretty remarkable number to get. but you can see how it does vary from one year to another, and it's all those factors come into play: how early the spring is, and how the fluctuations are. I just mentioned the European skipper, which can so overwhelm the number of total butterflies that we can get. Now, if we look at this graph, which shows the counts of the Sunderland count. Now, the total number of individuals, the blue line, separated from the red line, there's only 2 non-native species, being the European skipper and the cabbage white. And we can see in a couple of years, like 2003 and 2008, when the count hit the very peak of the European population, they can make up 75% of all the butterflies on the count. And then you can see a couple of other years, like between 2011 and 2013, when we had early springs, the butterflies emerged earlier, and by the time we had the count, the European peak had already passed and there weren't very many more around. So that's how you can see the difference from one year to another on the number of European skippers. And that affects the whole total. And this is what the European skipper looks like. It's a non-native butterfly, and it just can be, it feeds on common grasses, and sometimes they are just so abundant, it's unbelievable. Now, it's important to keep track of the hours of field effort, because that's maybe a better indication of how abundant butterflies are than the absolute numbers of the count. And in this case, I took those non-native species out, and it shows 2 of the counts that I run, the Sunderland count and the Oshawa count. You can see it can vary from up to 120 down to about 15 butterflies per hour, depending on the year and some of those factors that I mentioned. So it is critical to keep track not only of the butterflies, but of the area, or of the time that we're in the field. We keep track of how many kilometers we walk, but the hours are more important than the kilometers walked. Which are our most abundant butterflies? Well, I do keep track of all of the counts of Ontario, and so these percentages you see here are from the last 11 years of all of the Ontario butterfly counts. So you can see European skipper makes up about 1/3 of all of the butterflies counted, and the cabbage white, another non-native one, is the second most abundant. There's about, every year, there's between 90 and 100 species tallied on all of the Ontario counts, and so far in the last 11 years, we've had 125 species recorded. And it's interesting when we compare our numbers with other areas in North America. Sunderland, for example, has really high numbers of eyed browns. In fact, in 2003, we had the all-time highest count of eyed browns of all of North America. And we also have the all-time highest count of tawny-edged skippers. So it's partly a reflection that we have such good coverage. We get a lot of people out there, but it also shows you that we do have some pretty high densities in some of our areas. And how much butterflies can vary from one year to another is really surprising. Eastern-tailed blues on the Sunderland count. On the average year, we get about 12 eastern-tailed blues. We just did our count on Sunday. We had 6 this year. 2013, almost 400 eastern-tailed blues. They were just everywhere, and it almost defies logic, because most years there's a few little dry meadows that we can sort of count on getting eastern-tailed blues, but most places we never see them. And yet, for whatever reason, 2013, they were all over the place. So are these surprises when you do these counts from one year to another? Now, because of the variety of expertise, it's sometimes hard to look at the less common species or the obscure species like skippers to compare them from one year to another. But the bigger species that are really distinctive, easy to recognize, like the monarch, we can really use the butterfly count data to see how the numbers fluctuate from one year to another. For example, when I'm out on a count, I might get a lot more skippers than the other participants or groups, but I get about the same number of monarchs. And so that's why you don't need a lot of experience for some of those. These numbers on this graph show all of the monarchs recorded on all of the Ontario counts. So the top graph shows the actual total number, and you can see how it varies from about 200 up to 4,500. And then the bottom one is monarchs per hour of field effort. Again, you can see how it varies from one year to another. The two graphs, in this case, they look quite similar. And one thing you notice, 2012, we had a really high year, and the population just plummeted, declined. The next year we had 90%, and this was the time that it really hit the news that the monarch butterfly was really in decline and we might lose them completely. But you can see after that point, it stayed low for a number of years, but the last couple of years, the monarch numbers have really picked up again. So just because it looks like a species is tanking, sometimes these trends, they're going up and down, and certainly the butterfly counts have been able to help us with that. So here I'm throwing out a question to you. See what your knowledge is on monarchs. How many generations of monarchs do we have in a year? So if you can poll.
Okay, so the results are just trickling in now. I'm going to leave the poll up for about 45 seconds.
Now, one of the things about the monarchs on the counts is that because our counts are in the early to mid part of July, mostly, we don't actually hit the peak of monarch butterflies. Monarchs are monarchs have a couple broods, and by the late summer, late August, September, early September is when the peak monarchs are. Aha, so here is our results, what we think the number of generations per year. Most think 2 to 3, 4 to 5, and a few think much more than that. Now let's see, what is the answer? 4 to 5 generations to complete the annual cycle. As many of you may know, that one generation from late summer, they are the longest lived. They will live till about March or April, and the other 3 or 4 generations have a much shorter flying time. The count data is also useful for some other distinctive species. The red admiral, for example, is another migrant species that can fluctuate from one year to another. And this graph shows 3 species on the Sunderland butterfly count and how much they vary from one year to another. We have the blue, which is the monarch again, the red admiral, and you can see some years when there's really high numbers like 2001 and 2007 and some years when there's virtually none or completely none. The white admiral, on the other hand, is more, it doesn't vary so much from one year to another. You can see when we had a couple of years in the beginning when they were higher, but generally it's in around 0.5 to 1 butterfly per hour. So an interesting trend there. And speaking of white admiral, as you may well know, there are 2 subspecies of the admiral, which are very distinct, easy to recognize. The white admiral, which is the northern subspecies, and then the red spotted purple, which is more or less Carolinian. At least it doesn't range very far north. Now, looking at the Durham counts, we have an almost consistent 10% of red spotted purples to white admirals. If you get further south, if you went to Toronto, it would probably be more like 25% red spotted purples. If you get to Hamilton, it's more like 50%. And as you get in the Carolinian, the white admiral form will disappear altogether. So this is the kind of data we can get out of the butterfly counts. Some of our species are a challenge, and the taxonomists are telling us different things, different years, so we try to adapt. The tiger swallowtail, for example, we used to just have the one species in Ontario, what we call the eastern, but then it was divided into 2 species, formed a subspecies. the eastern and the Canadian. The Canadian being the earlier one with just smaller, more northern, and the eastern multi-brooded, larger, largely Carolinian. And over time, very difficult to tell apart, but one of the ways you tell them apart is by this band here. If they're dots, distinctive dots, that makes it an eastern. If it's just a solid band, that's a Canadian. So this one would be a pretty good eastern. But we've been finding the midsummer ones have been extending further and further north. And now the most recent indication is that we first thought they were easterns, but now it looks like the midsummer ones are actually a hybrid between the two species. So that one has been a point of confusion. Another one that's often a challenge are the crescents, the pearl crescent, the northern crescent, which look very similar, except you really look for this line here on the males. If the line is broken or not clear, that makes it a northern. If it's a complete line like here, that makes it a pearl. And they can, typically we get a lot more northerns than pearls. That one does present a bit of a challenge. Getting the experts out in the field, and especially consistent coverage by certain individuals that cover the same area year in year, they get to learn where to find particularly the specialized species. This, for example, is a mulberry wing skipper, not very common. Only a few counts ever get them, but they're very specific to sedge marshes. So unless you get the experts or someone trudging through the sedge marsh and really looking for those specific skippers, they're going to be missed. One of the really exciting things about butterflies is the butterfly counts is when we find something new, something unexpected. Last year on the Oshawa count, I had the first hickory hairstreak. It's quite an uncommon butterfly that generally isn't picked up on very many of the counts. And then we just had a butterfly count 2 days ago, the Sunderland count. And one of our participants took this photograph, and it's Atlantis Fritillary. It was new for Durham region. Not only was it new for our count, we had never had a record of an Atlantis Fritillary in Durham region. It's a more northern species, not rare, certainly as you get further north up in the Shield. And you can distinguish it by this black border along the edge, so it is quite distinct. And it's a narrower yellow band here than the great spangled. Another surprise we had a few years ago on the Sunderland count was the black dash. It was a more southern, a sedge specialist, so easy to miss it unless you get into the right habitat. But it was really a Carolinian species that we didn't think we had them in Durham at all, but I saw one, and clearly it was a black dash. A few years later, we were picking up more and more of them on the counts. This is a shot from the Butterfly Atlas, and the red dots show, the red squares show more historic. So you can see historically, we only had black dashes in the Carolinian area from here south. But here's the Sunderland area, and most of these squares were from black dashes that we picked up on one of the Sunderland counts. And you can see there's a couple of other more recent records also in Simcoe, and this one is actually Durham as well. So we are certainly getting people out in the field. We are finding some really good butterfly information, and especially some of the species have been extending the range north. Now here's two species, and I happen to find both of these species for the first time on an Halliburton count. They were not even known from Halliburton, but several years ago at our tally, I said, well, I had a Delaware skipper, and the compiler was pretty skeptical about that I actually had correctly identified it. But half a dozen years later, Halliburton had the highest count of Delaware skippers for Ontario. So it shows you how quickly butterfly populations can change when you get an expanding species. The other one, sorry, was a Dion skipper, which is another specialist of sedges that has been extending its range north. The giant swallowtail is another species that's been really expanding its range northward, and it's a spectacular one. It's the biggest butterfly in Canada, in fact. Feeds specifically on hop tree and prickly ash, and it has been showing up on some of the counts in the east and certainly in the Carolinian area. but they really are dependent on the food plant being available. Here you can see the caterpillar on prickly ash and the pupa. Now, prickly ash is quite uncommon in the GTA, so we are seeing some giants, but there's not, haven't picked them up on the counts yet. And then a few of the counts are known for having some of the rarer species. The mottled dusky wing, which you may know, is an endangered species. It's only found in a few places in Ontario. The larva feeds exclusively on New Jersey tea, and the Rice Lake Plains count typically picks up mottled dusky wing every year, and they're the only count that does so. We also have in Pinery, there's a little skipper called a dusted skipper, and it only extends marginally into that part of Ontario. So they get dusted skippers every year, but they're the only count that ever gets dusted skippers. So we have some of these little exciting things. Another thing about counts that are really exciting is when you get these vagrants or butterflies that don't show up very, very regularly. The cloudless sulfur is a big sulfur from the southeastern US, doesn't really occur in Ontario at all, but Rondo got one on their count a couple of years ago. These other three, the pipevine, the variegated, and the fiery skipper, usually we don't get them in years, but sometimes they will show up and then they will even lay their eggs and start breeding, forming temporary colonies that will not survive the winter. And so those are always exciting when we can pick up one of those unusual species. So that brings me to our second poll. To test your knowledge again. Approximately how many butterfly species do you think regularly occur in Ontario? So here we have, I'll give you another half a minute or so. Is it approximately 95, 140, 160, or 190? What do you think?
Hi, James. Well, we've got a little break here. The sound is just slightly choppy at times.
Okay.
Your mic is kind of not covered up in any way.
No, it's not. That's
Okay.
I just have the mic on. I don't have a separate mic.
Okay, it could just be an internet connection. Like it's mostly clear, just the odd time it flickers a bit.
Okay. $95, 20%, 140. Most think it's 140 or 160, and not many 190. Well, let's see what it is. $140 regular species and another 25 species which occasionally show up as vagrants. So the vagrants are really rare ones, like the southern, the cloudless sulfur. The picture shown here is a white M hairstreak, which has only showed up in Ontario a few times. So that you can see most of you were pretty on with 140. And if you add the two together, then you're in the 160. 2012, which you may remember, was quite an unusual year weather-wise. And it was also an unusual year butterfly-wise too. And that's why I call it a year like no other. It started in March. If you recall, we had this unusually warm spring in March. And this shows you that across the northeastern part of the US and extending into Ontario, the average temperature was significantly warmer. It was the only year that I saw frogs that normally call in April were calling in March. We had butterflies showing up, plants started flowering. It was truly a weird year. We had the biggest migration of red admirals really on record from that year. And I remember driving the 401 when they were just red admirals constantly flying overhead. Now, they didn't stick around as long as the count, so we didn't get exceptionally high red admirals on the butterfly counts. The numbers had already peaked by then. But other strange things did show up. One of them was this little butterfly, a tiny little sulfur called the dainty sulfur. And its normal range is way down like in the southwestern US, Kansas and south, and occasionally it gets in this area here. But we had colonies that started breeding, and they were picked up on several of the counts in extreme southwestern Ontario. We didn't really get them in the Toronto area, but certainly down there we did. And then after that, that was it, gone, no more dainty sulfurs. The buckeye is another one that's a lot more regular than the dainty sulfur, but it is not a species that has regular callings. It migrates up and may survive for 1 year and then usually fizzles out. In the Carolinian area, they're a lot more regular. But look at this, 2001, 80% of our counts picked up buckeyes in 2001. And after that, the numbers just plummeted, and only the Carolinian counts typically pick them up in most years. The bottom graph shows the number of counts that actually picked up butterflies, so buckeyes. So quite interesting how it can vary and how that 1 year was particularly noteworthy. There's a new butterfly to keep your eye open for. Hasn't showed up on any of the butterfly counts yet, but it almost certainly will very soon. It's called the European common blue. It appeared in Montreal about 5 years ago, and it's been expanding its range. It's been into Eastern Ontario, and it has even showed up in the Toronto area last year. So it's possible that one of the counts may pick them up this year, but if not this year, almost for sure in the next few years. Just cover a little bit about habitats for butterflies, because habitat is critical. As many of you probably know, Ontario is historically forest covered, and since butterflies aren't hanging out in the forest by and large, the numbers were probably pretty low through much of the province compared to now. And with agriculture, clearing of the trees, pasturing, cultivating land, abandoning pastures, a lot of the butterflies numbers increased. And even disturbed areas like gravel pits can provide good habitat. In a place like this, we get a hillside, the range of low, wet meadow rising up to a drier meadow is ideal. Sedge marshes. Now, one of the changes that we've noticed in the counts is when we first started the count, particularly the Sunderland count, we had unbelievably high numbers of butterflies, particularly on that rail trail, which is really why I even started that count. In more recent years, something has happened. And at first I couldn't figure it out because the habitat is still there. The trail goes through these wetlands and there's thickets along the side. But in the earlier days, when we started the count, it was a lot more open. It was a railway, the railway was pulled up, the trail was put in, and there were all these milkweeds and other plants, flowering plants beside the trail. But as succession has happened, those plants have largely disappeared. And so the butterfly numbers along that rail trail are not what they used to be. Columbine dusky wing, we had quite a few the first few counts, and we're not picking them up anymore. So succession, a natural process, will eventually eliminate the butterflies. Butterfly habitat. Oops, here's another thing we have been finding on some of our counts, and I'm sure it's happening everywhere. This was taken in 2005. You can look at this habitat. We've got meadow marsh here. We've got thickets, hedgerow, swamp over here. Great butterfly habitat. But look what happened. This is what it looks like now. They have completely taken out the hedgerows. They've even taken out the wetland. Nevertheless, part of a PSW, but agriculture is exempt. And so we are losing a lot of habitat. Now, the count circle is so big that when we lose a habitat like that, we find somewhere else. So it doesn't always reflect the actual decline in butterflies that might have happened. Fields like this, not great habitat. You'll get a few butterflies along the edge of the woodlot, but intensive agriculture, not so good for butterflies. Another issue that we're finding all over is the invasive plants. Butterflies need nectar or they need larval food plants. We get dog strangling vine, buckthorn taking over these habitats. And so we've seen a definite decline. I know I participate in the East Toronto count, and the amount of dog strangling vine there is so rampant that we really have to search hard to find good butterfly habitats that aren't overrun with. And so but butterflies are kind of dependent on periodic abandonment of habitats, of agriculture to keep habitat. And I was happy to see on our recent count that an area that was cultivated for a few years has been abandoned, and it's just turned into good butterfly habitat again. But by and large, it's a temporary thing that needs certain disturbance periodically. And fortunately, butterflies, being such strong flyers, are able to colonize new habitats pretty quickly. So that's the plus side. So just in summary, the butterfly counts are a great citizen science program that a lot of people can participate in, and we're getting generally more people every year to get out there and do their part to count. It's also a good learning experience. Sometimes we get children that come out, we get experts or other novices that can quickly learn their butterflies. We contribute to the Butterfly Atlas, so a lot of the records that you see come from butterfly counts, and just learning more about the butterfly fauna in any particular area. So it really is, we've learned so much about the butterflies in Durham since I started these counts, just what kind of habitat they're in, what their season is. And certain species we can monitor quite effectively, the larger showy ones like monarch. And Ontario has done really well compared to many of the other places in North America, because most of our counts, we get groups of people out there. We really get good coverage compared to many of the other counts across the province, across North America. And interestingly enough, across Canada, the counts haven't taken off the same degree as they have in Ontario. Now, in Alberta, in 1999, Alberta had more butterfly counts than any other state or province. But since then, they've given up on it for whatever reason. Maybe there weren't enough butterflies out there to make it interesting, but now there's only a few in Alberta, a few in Saskatchewan. British Columbia, which has great butterfly habitat, has never had a butterfly count in it. So we can be happy, we can be proud of our Ontario effort on the counts. I think the Toronto Entomological Association has played a big role because all of the counts are advertised in here, and if anyone is interested in joining a count, check the website and you'll see where they are. So my last question I will just throw out at you is, you know that butterflies are part of Lepidoptera, part of the moth. Moths are also Lepidoptera. Now, you probably know there's more moth species than butterflies in Ontario, but how many more moths than butterflies do you think there are in Ontario? We know there's about 120 butterflies now. How many times that are moths? Is it 5? Is it 10? Is it 20? Or is it as many as 50? Do your poll and let me know, and we'll see how you do.
James, there's a quick question that's pretty relevant to this poll, which was, do they run moth counts as well?
No, there's no moth. There are dragonfly counts though, but there are no moth counts that I've ever seen. Certainly moths are being documented on some of the bioblitzes, but catching moths or identifying moths is a little bit different because you really need light. Okay, so we are pretty evenly split. 5 times, 10 times. So it must be either 10 or 20 times. That's where most of the guesses are. Let's just see what that could be. 20 times more moths. So there are roughly 3,000 species of moths in Ontario. Here's an example of one of the moths, the oval-based prominent. But generally when you're out, you see some day-flying moths, but you really need a light trap, or at least a light to be able to track them in and it's really hard to get a sense of numbers. And when you get this massive number of species, it is a real challenge to try to identify. And the other thing of counts, of course, it is fun. It is great fun getting out there, out in the good weather, challenging yourself, learning about something new, and contributing to citizen science. So I really encourage any of you that have never been on a count, try and find out one and try and participate. This isn't the best year, I know, but most of the counts are still being done. The tallies aren't happening, but the results are being sent in by email and people are still getting out. At this point, I will open it up for any questions that might be directed to Caroline.
Great, thanks, James. We have had some questions roll in, some great questions, so I'll be pretty quick. We'll try to field as many as we can during the webinar, and what we can't, we'll try to field afterwards in the email. So the time is currently about 10:12, so I'll put a hard cap at 10 minutes past 12, so we'll get to whatever we can in that time. First question is from another longtime member and good friend of Ontario Nature, Don Davis. And some of this you touched on in your presentation, but he's asking if you've noticed a distinct decline in the number of insects in general in the wild, and how much can be attributed to the massive application of pesticides, and herbicides, and use of GMOs, and climate change, habitat loss, and so on.
Yes, that is certainly a question that's on our mind a lot. I've noticed this year that mosquitoes are fewer than I've ever seen before. Now, maybe it's because of the warm, we've had a kind of a dry spell lately. It's been a drier than usual spring, so that might be part of it. But I do have a sense that the mosquitoes, whether it's application or drainage of habitat, that one certainly comes to mind. We have noticed in the last few years, now the Sunderland count seemed to be pretty well, but I'm often getting comments that, you know, we're just not getting the same number of butterflies that we used to. And it's always hard to attribute it for sure to pesticides, but we know that there's more and more of them out there. We're seeing these massive fields, like I showed you that picture. I was just by there on Sunday, and that field it must be hundreds of hectares of soybeans. So think of all the application of pesticides on there. It's going to be having an impact on insects, the drift and all that. So yes.
Thanks. Here's another question. This one's from Don McMurtry. Again, another good friend of Ontario Nature. So he says, everyone knows that monarch migrates from Ontario to Mexico. What other butterflies have consistent migration from Ontario to the south?
Okay, that's a good question. We certainly have other migrants. None of them are known so well as the monarch, and they probably don't concentrate the way that the monarchs do. But we know that red admirals, painted ladies, American ladies, and question marks, those are all migrants that can be variable from one year to another. There's also, like, the snout butterfly is a migrant, the gray hairstreak is a migrant. Those are less common ones, but they do all migrate, and they generally go to the southeastern US.
Okay, there's a couple questions about, is there a website or some resource to find out about counts that are coming up?
Yeah, now the best website has been the Toronto Entomological Association, but I think this year they haven't been listed. So I know what it says on there is, if you've gone on counts in the past, check with the compiler to see whether those counts are still being done. And I know most of them are still being done. Doesn't help you if you're new and have never done a count and you're looking for the closest count in your area. You could, yeah, you could certainly, yeah, there's no certainly. Yeah, I can't think of what else to say other than try and track down whoever did the counts before, and next year, hopefully it'll be back to normal. The COVID will have dissipated and we'll be running the counts a little more normally, and the TEA will advertise again.
I should add, on our Ontario Nature calendar, we'd be happy to post any if anybody does run counts and would like them on to find a place to put them on.
Great.
There's been a couple of questions about monarchs. So what do you think about hand rearing monarchs inside houses, i.e. pick local milkweed and feed the larvae and then release the adults safely from our homes?
Yeah, there's a great educational value to that, and just exposure of raising the caterpillars, seeing that transformation. I know last year, and we've been doing that quite a bit, my wife and I at home. Now, last year there was a paper that came out that was suggesting that even as benign as that is, it might be confusing the caterpillars so that they're not able to migrate effectively because they're not out in the full sun. You wouldn't think that it would have that effect, but that is what some of the research has shown. So probably would be better to keep it in a cage outside if you wanted to raise them. It's a lot more difficult to do that. So that is the latest research on that. So,
okay, and just a quick follow-up question to that. So say you did that, does that help, and say you did it outside, as you're suggesting, would that help population numbers?
I think the numbers are going to be so small that you raise, it's probably really not going to make much of a difference, because either there's going to be lots of monarchs like last year, and it wouldn't make a difference. And even if it's a low year of monarchs, you think of the amount of habitat out there in the milkweed, and the number of monarchs that anybody would raise would just be such a minuscule fraction of that. I really don't think it would have much of an effect on the population. It's more of an education. The reason to do it isn't so much to help the monarch, it's more exposure, get the public more interested in protecting insects and the environment generally.
Okay, and then how are the counts reported and to whom?
The counts are, well, I since I'm the coordinator for the North American Butterfly Association, many of the counts are submitted to the North American Butterfly Association. Now, however, those counts, you have to pay a fee of $5 per person fee for the counts, and some of the count compilers they've stopped sending it to NABA, but all the counts should be sent to the Toronto Entomological Association. In fact, I usually send an email out to all of the counts that I know have been going on, so they get the results to me, and that is published in the annual report by the Toronto Entomological Association. So like last year, all of the counts, I put all of them in a table so you could look at it and see how many counts there were and how many monarchs each of the different counts had. So that is the best place. I'd encourage you to join the Toronto Entomological Association, subscribe to their, and once you join, then you automatically will get that publication.
Okay, so somebody's saying they're seeing a lot of swallowtails flying around and caterpillars eating herbs. How long until they go into the pupae stage and then hatch?
Yeah, it's been a really good year for tiger swallowtails. We've picked up really good numbers on the counts that I've been on. We're getting into the summer brood of the tiger swallowtails. I don't know if they're referring more to the black swallowtails. The black swallowtails are the ones that you get in your garden that feed on either dill or parsley or wild carrots. And so those ones, you will see the caterpillars. The tiger swallowtails rarely ever see the caterpillars because they feed on trees and they're a lot harder to find. The black swallowtails are multi-brooded. There's 2 or 3 broods a year. So there's some flying around now, and they will be flying around later on, a final brood later in the summer.
Okay, there's a comment here about Harold Pasternak's book on monarchs is a good resource somebody's suggesting. I'm
familiar with that one, but.
Are there others that you would recommend?
Well, for identification, the Butterflies of Ontario, the one put out by the Royal Ontario Museum a couple of years ago, that is a really good one. there is the Butterflies of Canada, which is now older. It's got nice big plates, so it's really nice to compare all the different skippers. For example, they're only on a couple of plates, which is a little easier than the Butterflies of Ontario, which you have to flip through pages to get them. I really like the pictures in both of those two publications. There was that Kaufman book that came out a few years ago on butterflies of Eastern North America, I think. And I just find the pictures in there just don't look as true to the butterfly. So, and now there are resources online. I know there's Rick Kavasin, who's out of Ottawa. He has a, I'm not sure if he calls it Butterflies of Ontario, but that's a really good resource. He's got pictures of all of the butterflies that we have in Ontario, including the rare ones. So that's another good resource for learning the butterflies. And there are also books, yeah, there you go, Butterflies of Canada. That's a great one. And I don't have the other one handy right here, but the Butterflies of Ontario is a really great one as well. There is any other websites? I know there's other websites from some of the US states have got good websites as well for IDing these butterflies. And then there's iNaturalist. If you photograph a butterfly and you really can't identify it, you submit it to iNaturalist and you will get it identified there. So there are some really good resources now.
Okay, here's a question. So I want to set up a count on a new 156-acre nature reserve on the Oak Ridges Moraine in the Rice Lake Plains with some wetlands, lots of hay fields, and some hardwood forest. How do I do it?
Okay, if to be a NABA count, a North American Butterfly Association count, it has to be, it can't overlap another count in that circle. Now, however, many of the counts, you wouldn't do the whole circle anyway. You just, maybe you don't need to do the whole circle. So to register it, you don't even, unless you're gonna do a NABA count, you don't really need to register it, but I would encourage, so you could just set it up and I'd be happy to send any advice on it. And you could go to the NABA website to see how they do the counts, but you could do a much smaller circle if you wanted to, but I really would encourage that at the very least to send the results to the Toronto Entomological Association or to me, and I'll make sure that they get put in that publication. But I'd be happy if they want to contact me, I'd be happy to help them set it up. Otherwise, because it's great to get more counts. It'd be nice to have another count on the Rice Lake Plains. We have the one that's done by Nature Conservancy actually, but if there's another one, that would be great.
Here's just a suggestion from one of our members about good action to help monarchs is of course to plant milkweed in your yard. It's kind of just something we can all do. Another for a book suggestion, Rick Kavasin's Butterflies of Southern Ontario, the 4th edition.
Okay, yeah.
And here's a question. So is there a reason why there are more moth species compared to butterfly species in Ontario?
Well, that's not just Ontario. I think that you would find anywhere in the world, you'd have 20 times as many moths as butterflies. Now moths they don't gravitate to sun the same way like butterflies do. At least maybe a few of them do, but by and large, most of them are nocturnal. And in a forest, so in a forest, which is not very good butterfly habitat, with a few exceptions, it's great moth habitat because there's all those trees. So many species of moths feed on trees, like maple trees, ash, oaks. There's so many species of moths. And I think the fact that, and some of them are really tiny, like you think you got small butterflies, but we got moths that are way, way smaller than butterflies. So many of those species of moths are really tiny. And so it's just, there's just, I guess, more niches for the moths, and the fact that they don't gravitate to the sun, I think that's a big thing.
Great. We've clearly got some citizen scientists on the webinar. Here's another book recommendation, Peterson's Field Guide to Moths. There's somebody, a gentleman who lives in Toronto, is asking about an almost complete absence of monarchs so far this year. Do we have any sort of knowledge about how their numbers looked in Mexico and the migration and all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, I know Don Davis would be the person to ask about the wintering, because I haven't seen the latest and how it's gone. I found seeing the first monarch was later than usual. Usually I see my first monarch around the 1st of June. It wasn't until well into June before I saw the monarch. Now we did the count on Sunday. We picked up moderate number of monarch, not as good as last year for sure, but the numbers are starting to build, and so it seems like they've come back later, maybe because it was a late spring, and so maybe they just arrived a little bit later, and so their life cycle is a little delayed. I guess once we get later on into the later counts, we'll probably be picking up more monarchs, and then once we get into August, then we'll really know for sure what they're doing.
Thanks. There's somebody mentions that they're hit with some frost in Mexico and some in Texas, so that could have negatively impacted them as well.
Yeah.
On a butterfly count, is it best to use a net or a camera?
Yeah, that's one thing that definitely should use. Binoculars are way more useful than a net. Yeah, it's good to net the odd one if you're really not quite sure what it is, but I'll much prefer, for one thing, some of them are really hard to catch. You can try and get a fritillary or a hairstreak, and these things are just like lightning. So you really try to keep your eye on that butterfly, and when he lands, then get your binoculars on it. Look for those field marks. The skippers, often there's either a C mark or a yellow patch or some kind of a patch that's quite distinctive. But if you get it in a net, first of all, you got to get it in a jar because you can't see it through the net, and then it flutters around like mad in the jar. So the binoculars are the best. The camera is great when you get something you're not quite sure what it is. We had, for example, on this last Sunday, my wife was out with me and we got separated, and she was looking at these skippers. She took a picture of this skipper and it looked like a sachem, which is a really rare vagrant skipper. But we looked at it closely, and I even sent it to a couple of experts to confirm. It turned out to be a long dash that was really, really worn, but the patch on it looked so much like a sachem. And so that's where the photography is just, it confirms it. And now you see that Atlantis Fritillary. Well, if the guy would have just seen it and he goes, well, I'm pretty sure it was Atlantis, but once you got the photo, hey, there's no doubt. So yes, a net is useful for some of those ones, but take your binoculars. If you only have to take one, take your binoculars over the net for sure.
Okay, there's another question about so the list in your slideshow looked at Southern Ontario. Sudbury was on the map, but are there any counts in Sudbury?
Yes, there is a count in Sudbury. There is one count in Sudbury. I think it's coordinated through the Science Center.
Okay, great.
Oh, yeah. That's the most northern one, other than there's two in northwestern Ontario. One at Atikokan, which is right on the Minnesota border, and then another one near Lake of the Woods. But otherwise, none others north of Sudbury.
Okay, I'm just looking. I think we're basically through our questions.
Okay.
Okay, so I guess maybe I'll do a quick teaser. We're going to do another webinar with James Patterson, who was on staff at Ontario Nature for a number of years, and he's going to do it on snakes. So that'll happen later in August, and I'd encourage you to tune in. He's sort of fascinating presenter as well. I'd like to really thank James for what was a fascinating presentation, and especially it really struck me during the presentation how much, citizen science is based on volunteer work. A few kind of really rise above and put a lot of time, a lot of expertise, and a lot of effort into protecting species. So I bet there's a lot of people on the call or on the webinar as well who are doing the same sort of thing. And just like to thank everybody for that type of action to protect nature in this province. Like to quick note that our members, through your membership support, are allowing us to do a lot of the work we do to protect butterflies and other species. So big thanks for that. We will be recording, or we have been recording the webinar. So in the follow-up email, we'll send you the recording and we'll post it on our YouTube channel as well. And we also will be sharing slides of the recording in that email. So if you, for some who missed the webinar, or you want to send it to friends and family, or you want to watch it a second time, you'll be able to do that. So I think that's it, unless James, you have any sort of final words?
Yeah, my final word is I encourage you to try to get involved with counts if you haven't done it. I'm sure many of you have done some of the counts, but get out there, contact me or TEA, and well, learn your butterfly.